We define ourselves through our history, culture, and food, but we so rarely think to stop and ask, how does it all work? Revealed examines the hows and whys while pulling the curtain back on the things you never thought to ask. On this episode, we learn about the tumultuous construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, the family behind the plan, and the unsung heroine who stepped up against all odds.
This was considered one of the engineering achievements of the entire century.
It was considered an architectural marvel. It was the longest suspension bridge built in the U.S.
Every year, hundreds of thousands of people travel from around the world to cross the Brooklyn Bridge.
On a day like today, maybe 30 to 40,000 people crossing the bridge.
And while the iconic structure has connected Manhattan and Brooklyn for well over a century, people in the 1800s seriously doubted whether it could be built.
And this was in an era when there were bridges that were failing. So people really questioned the safety of, can we span this entire river from Manhattan to Brooklyn? Is that possible?
The story of the Brooklyn Bridge is one of human endurance.
They estimate all in about 2,500 people would have worked within the Caissons as a part of the Brooklyn Bridge project.
Innovation.
John and Washington's bridge is built 6 times stronger than it needs to be.
Tragedy and setbacks.
The building of the bridge was a bit of a series of unfortunate events.
And perseverance.
So Washington's wife Emily stepped in. 3rd time's a charm.
Considering the time, it was a pretty big deal that she was able to have such an instrumental role.
Behind every great feat of engineering is a group of innovators who paved the way for future generations. In the case of the Brooklyn Bridge, it happened to be a family affair.
It is the story of the 3 Roeblings that made that bridge happen. John, the designer, the father, Washington, the civil engineer, and his wife, Emily, who stepped in when he couldn't do the work.
The Roeblings rose to a challenge that many thought was impossible.
And this was, at the time, fairly unthinkable. The East River was very wide. To build a bridge across it was scientifically very, very challenging. Engineering-wise, people did not think it could be done. And this was in an era when there were bridges that were failing. So people really questioned the safety of, can we span this entire river from Manhattan to Brooklyn? Is that possible? My name is Ashley Semrick, and I'm a public historian, an elementary school teacher, and a New York City tour guide. I like to tell Emily's story because we are still learning new things about her. We're still learning new things about her husband and the family she came from. And it informs how we feel about our city and our structures. Every time we look at a building or a bridge or a park, there's a name on a plaque, and there's many human stories behind that.
To understand the Roebling story and how important Emily's role was in completing the Brooklyn Bridge, we have to go back to the beginning, when a bridge across the East River was nothing more than an idea on paper.
Lower Manhattan was always a commercial center because Wall Street existed.
In the mid-1800s, New York City was taking shape as the bustling metropolis we know today. As the population grew, so did the need to transport people across the river between the cities of Manhattan and Brooklyn.
Before the Brooklyn Bridge was built, people used ferries to get from Manhattan to Brooklyn. The ferry service was not very reliable. If there was bad weather or anything else happening, if the river had too much ice or frozen over, it was really hard for people to get between both places. These are just some photos of the harbor. I really love that this one shows the choppiness and ice. So again, talking about why the ferry boat service wasn't like the ideal way to get across because you had to deal with the elements. This is a photo of a collision between 2 of the boats at Fulton Ferry. Folks on the Manhattan side in Brooklyn, because Brooklyn was still an independent city, decided that they needed to have a new mode of transportation.
The idea of a bridge dates back to the early 1800s. There were proposals for chain and linked bridges above ground and tunnels deep below the bedrock, but the 1,600-foot span of the East River provided a challenge never faced before.
So this stretch across the East River that they were talking about was 50% longer than the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time.
Katie often leads groups over the Brooklyn Bridge, giving modern-day tourists a 19th century perspective on the structure.
1, 2, and 3. People were so nervous about the Brooklyn Bridge, which I really do understand. There were people that would look at it and say, well, there's nothing in the middle.
The building committee turned to an engineering pioneer of a bridge design for a solution.
The man they ended up hiring for the job was named John Augustus Roebling. He had just designed a bridge called the Covington-Cincinnati Bridge between Covington, Kentucky and Cincinnati, Ohio. Prior to the Brooklyn Bridge, that was the longest suspension bridge in the world. And a lot of the same techniques and some of the same design work were actually implemented on the Brooklyn Bridge, just on a much, much larger scale.
John Roebling was made chief engineer in 1867, and the bridge, then known as the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, began taking shape. Ordinary construction projects have their own challenges and setbacks, but the events that occurred during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge were anything but ordinary.
The building of the bridge was a bit of a series of unfortunate events.
So about 1 month before construction was going to begin, John Roebling, he had been out doing a series of surveys of the future bridge site at a place called Fulton Ferry Landing.
And a ferry is approaching very quickly. The ferry does not slow down and actually crashes into the dock.
John Roebling's foot ended up pinned against the ferry pier by this incoming ferry. His foot was completely crushed.
And he developed tetanus.
Doctor said his foot was so damaged that they would need to amputate his toes.
And he actually ended up succumbing to sepsis and gangrene.
With the bridge's lead engineer dead just a month before construction began, all eyes turned to John's son, Washington Roebling.
And he's 32 at the time. And we have in a primary source him saying that the pillar that he had leaned upon was gone, his father. But that luckily he had someone of wisest counsel to turn to, and that was Emily. He really regarded her as being of equal intelligence and mind. Like, he really believed in the power that she had as both his partner and his wife. And so construction on the bridge got underway.
Construction of the bridge began in 1869, and Washington Roebling made it a point to be at the build site as much as possible to oversee the complex process.
Very, very first thing, the anchors had to be built on both Manhattan and Brooklyn.
A large amount of time was spent digging out sections of the riverbed in giant pressurized chambers called caissons.
Picture a big wooden box. It's closed on every side except for the bottom side. It would be open to the bottom. They'd sink these down onto the riverbed, and then they would pump pressurized air down inside the caisson, inside the box, and then workers went down inside this box with shovels, down and down and down and down and down until you hit bedrock. On any given day, they would have about 250 workers coming in and out of this caisson.
These are illustrations that show what it was like for the workers to be down there. So this really highlights kind of how tight that space was.
At the time, builders had less machinery and automation to rely on, which meant a lot of the work was dangerous, grueling physical labor.
So the workers were suspended on wires, essentially, to get those wires laid between the pillars of the bridge. So imagine not being trained to be a tightrope walker, but also having to do that as your job. So pretty dangerous.
The builders working high above the East River in charge of spinning the wires together were paid about $2 a day, which was a considerable amount of money at the time.
There's two types of cables on this bridge. The suspension cables, the four main cables, and then these smaller cables that are called anchor cables. If they ever unraveled the entire Brooklyn Bridge and laid every wire out tip to tip, you could go from here all the way across the US to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and then come back to the Brooklyn Bridge, and then make the whole round trip one more time. It's a lot of wire.
There are 20 known deaths tied to the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, and numerous injuries, including an uptick in a little-known illness at the time called Caisson Disease, or what we call the bends today.
Historically, we hear about the disease, the bends. The bends is what happens when you rise from a compression environment too quickly to the surface. Nitrogen bubbles develop in your blood, and it's very painful. It can affect your joints and your limbs and your eyesight and your hearing, and in some extreme cases can even cause death.
One of the most severe cases was Washington Roebling.
Washington Roebling was working inside of one of those, and there was actually a fire, and he was trying to direct how to put the fire out. And in his hurry to get out of there to be able to go and assist with the fire, he came up too quickly.
He became paralyzed from the waist down. He lost some of his vision. He lost some of his hearing. For a long time, he was extremely sensitive to any bright lights, loud noises. He had a series of strokes. He was really very, very ill after this. So much so that he actually rarely left his house again.
After losing 2 chief engineers, construction was behind schedule and already over budget. Washington and Emily Roebling were under pressure to get the job done.
This committee overseeing the bridge, more or less, they were going to fire him. They were going to replace him with somebody else. They said, no, we need somebody that can be here. Both Washington and Emily did not want that to happen.
Less than a year into construction, the Brooklyn Bridge was behind schedule. Its designer, John Roebling, died following an accident at the bridge site, and his son, Washington Roebling, was bedridden. The Roeblings were under pressure to get the job done, so Washington turned to the one person he could trust, his wife, Emily.
In the 1870s, it was not an option for him to look at them and be like, no, it's cool, my wife will take it from here. People believed that women's brains were biologically incapable of that kind of math and science. So what was officially pitched was that Washington would oversee and watch construction from their home, Brooklyn Heights. They said, no problem, Washington will have a telescope, field glasses, he will look out the window, he will make very precise technical notes and calculations out of that window, and Emily's just gonna messenger them back and forth.
Well, we all know that communication is how a project gets done, and so she was in charge of that.
The tragedies that fell on the Roebling family drew Emily into a role that should have cemented her place in history as a key player in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge.
There was issues with building. They were already over budget. The media was very doubtful that this project was going the right way. There was a lot of anti-bridge rhetoric happening, which you can imagine also led to their stress. And so this is where Emily truly gets the spotlight cast upon her as the person who stepped up and took over bridge construction.
Ashley Semrick uses her knowledge as a historian and her experience as an actor to shed light on the Roebling story in a unique way.
We call it historical costumed interpretation. Initially, when Washington fell ill, you see his eyesight was so poor, he couldn't even write or read. And so often I was reading correspondence to him and then transcribing what he wanted to say back. It became such that I had to stand in and actually answer myself on behalf of Washington to contractors and builders and people who were coming with questions about the bridge and about the construction. And so I was his eyes, ears, mouth, and communication. It was at that point that people realized that while I was not necessarily building the bridge, I was instrumental in the communication that helped facilitate the ongoing construction of this massive project.
On May 24, 1883, after nearly 14 years of construction, the Brooklyn Bridge was officially opened to the public with much fanfare. It's estimated that 1,800 carriages and more than 150,000 pedestrians crossed the bridge on that first day.
As part of her contributions to building the bridge, Emily Roebling was one of the first people to cross in a carriage. She also held a rooster, which symbolized good luck.
New York City effectively shuts down. If you can imagine Times Square on New Year's, that's what was happening on either side of the bridge in 1883. No school, they were setting up fireworks. You could imagine bunting, decorative bunting everywhere. Shops were closed, just wall-to-wall people. It was a true celebration, a marvel of engineering, a worldwide wonder, and something really special for our city.
This is a letter from someone. He wrote his aunt describing what it was like to see the bridge open and to see those opening ceremonies. Dear Aunt, Papa has sent Uncle a paper with the picture of the bridge on it. We will tell you all about it. There was a great time here in Brooklyn on that day, and I went over and saw it too. There were fireworks on the towers of the bridge, and it was lovely. The president came from Washington to walk across the bridge, and the streets were so crowded with people that we could hardly see where we were walking. From your cousin, Isaac Pascal.
Even with all the fanfare, people were still wary of the bridge's stability, and a freak accident led to a huge setback in public trust.
So 1 week after opening, it was late May, they think about 20,000 people were out on the Brooklyn Bridge, and somebody screamed. They screamed because they tripped. Somebody else heard a scream. They yelled out that the bridge was collapsing. People panicked. They went running for the exits. And at least 12 people were crushed to death in the stampede that happened. And after that, people didn't want to walk on the Brooklyn Bridge anymore.
Officials in Manhattan and Brooklyn needed pedestrians to use the bridge so that they would pay the 2-cent toll put in place to pay off the project. So city officials turned to an unusual solution to prove the bridge was sturdy.
1 year after this happened, May of 1884, P.T. Barnum came to town with the circus, walked 21 elephants across the Brooklyn Bridge, and people were like, okay. So that was the solution. Elephants saved the day.
The Brooklyn Bridge is more or less the same today as it was when it was built.
John and Washington's bridge is built 6 times stronger than it needs to be. Redundancy is built into the design.
So this is the original size and design of the Brooklyn Bridge. Down below where the cars are now, when the bridge opened up, that would have been anybody crossing with a horse, a carriage, a cart, and there was quite a bit of traffic that needed to move back and forth across the bridge.
The only major renovation to the bridge happened in the 1950s when the underdeck was reinforced to support the weight of modern cars and traffic. On average, around 149,000 people cross the Brooklyn Bridge every day. New Yorkers and tourists can feel connected to the city's history while walking through its iconic Gothic arches.
It's so pretty. I mean, you're surrounded by so much going on and so many people. This bridge is more architecturally intriguing, I think, as you're walking across it.
All in all, I like the bridge. I like how you can see New York and Brooklyn. Very nice.
So what I really love about this bridge is how you see like the skyline of New York. You have like all these different viewpoints, and I've never been to a bridge that is like that.
Really awesome. You can take good pictures here. But there are many people, but when you're on the bridge, you're like free.
It's very exciting. There's always like something to be stimulated by.
Fully appreciate just how impressive the Brooklyn Bridge was in its time. I know by today's standards it's not. It's not the tallest or the longest or any of those things, but this was considered one of the engineering achievements of the entire century in the US.
To see these absolutely massive towers rising above everything, there were people who had never seen a structure that tall in their entire life.
Coming up, the lasting legacy of the Brooklyn Bridge and parts of the story that were once forgotten.
So on this plaque up here, you have a list of engineers. The only name that's pretty notably absent would be Washington's wife, Emily.
The Brooklyn Bridge has stood over New York City for over a century. A feat once thought of as impossible was completed by the Roeblings, whose legacy will be forever tied to the Great Connector. Today, historians are uncovering more about Emily's significant role throughout the building process.
So on this plaque up here, you have a list of engineers, and you'll see John Roebling up there at the top. He is absolutely credited as the primary designer behind the Brooklyn Bridge. And his son Washington is right underneath him. The only name that's pretty notably absent would be Washington's wife, Emily, even though she was here every day for more than 13 years. Officially, she wasn't working for the bridge. She never had a job or a title. She was never paid. Officially, she was just here, helping out.
Today's historians are working to piece together more of Emily's story to better understand the impact of her involvement.
Right after the bridge opened, her voice, her name, her likeness sort of fell out of the discourse. And now that we're coming back to this era where we're really trying to understand the truth of history, who people were, the good and the bad, we see her name coming back again and again, which is really, really fortunate.
Good for her. I'm proud of her. I love that. I like that this is a woman's bridge.
The Brooklyn Bridge is a reminder of how perseverance through difficult times can leave a lasting legacy for years to come.
I think if Emily were to be able to come back and comment on New York today, she would probably be amazed, first of all, by how many bridges there are connecting all of our boroughs. And I also think that she would be really pleased how many girls and women are now invested in the sciences, in architecture, in math. So I think for Emily to come back and see our transformed city and know that women have had a hand in helping continue the legacy of what she started, she would be quite pleased.
A symbol of human ingenuity that continues to stand the test of time.
So I still think of the Brooklyn Bridge as a great connector. Just because so many people come to New York and come specifically to see that bridge, it definitely gets a lot more attention than the other bridges in New York City.
I think what I really love about the Brooklyn Bridge and what I always try to convey is nothing is just a structure, nothing is just a building. There's always a story behind something. And in the case of the Brooklyn Bridge, it's a really interesting story and a pretty dramatic story.